In many areas where slavery was the most profitable in the South, Africans constituted a majority or a substantial section of the population groups in the counties and regions of various states. So in many areas in the South, black people were the majority as a result of the importation of slaves and the production of agricultural goods and commodities. This was the situation in areas of Mississippi, in Alabama, in South Carolina, Tennessee, Louisiana, and in other states, where as a result of the system of cotton and other agricultural commodities production, Africans outnumbered whites, both the slave owners as well as the non-slave owning whites. However, in Texas, where Major General Granger order was declared some 145 years ago today, the demographic situation was different than in many other areas of the South. W.B. Du Bois, in his study entitled Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America from 1860 to 1880, and this book was published in 1935 during the Great Depression. He says that, quote, Texas had in 1860 182,921 Negroes and 420,891 whites, thus putting this state among those where the Negro population was a decided minority, and the white migration destined greatly to increase the preponderance of the whites, unquote. Du Bois also notes that in Texas, quote, the division of the planters and poor whites was less distinct in this state than in many others, unquote. As a result of the Mexican-American War and the seizure of Texas by white settlers and by the United States government, there was much of what Du Bois described as, quote, plenty of rich land and the poorest white men could get a start. This increased demand for labor, unquote. So the Mexican-American War, the seizure by the United States of Mexican territory in Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth, actually increased white European settler migration to the southwest portion of the United States. Mind you, this was part of Mexico. These are the same people who today they swear up and down are illegal. People who they want to deport, who they want to lock up. In actuality, that is their country. They have more of a historical claim to that territory, far more so than the U.S. capitalist class in this country. Now, the resistance to the campaign of Africans was immediate and violent on the part of the Confederate soldiers and their supporters. Du Bois recounts that, quote, when the war neared its end, the Confederate troops in Texas got out of hand and began rebelling and looting. Towns like Houston, which is the largest town in Texas, were burned, and clothes and food of all sorts of goods were stolen. The Texas Republican, which was a newspaper at the time, stressed, quote, the ruinous effect of freeing 4 million ignorant and helpless blacks, unquote, and said that the people of the North would be glad to witness a return of slavery because it would raise, quote, larger crops and a richer market for Yankee manufacturers, unquote. This pattern of destruction and looting was repeated in other cities in the South, including Richmond, Virginia, where Confederate troops sought to burn down the city when the Union troops arrived with a sizable regiment of black soldiers who liberated the city in April of 1865. And when I was in Virginia recently, I went to the location, have a placard where the black soldiers arrived in Richmond. And there's a dispute over who got there first, whether the black troops got there first or whether the white troops got there first. You know, the black troops say they got there first. You know, I tend to believe them. Yeah. But anyway, the mayor of the city of Richmond at the time commended the black troops for putting down the destruction that was going on that was carried out by the Confederate troops in Richmond, Virginia, when the city was liberated. They burned businesses, they destroyed food, they burned houses. The same thing they did, and it was repeated throughout various areas of the southern part of the United States. The passage of the 13th Amendment was significant because it included a provision in Section 2 which declared, and Andrea mentioned this, quote, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, unquote. That's a very key aspect of the 13th Amendment. The radicals in Congress, like Charles Sumner, believed that this granted the power to enfranchise African people. It must be kept in mind that at the end of the Civil War, many of the southern states were under a minority control with appointed military governors. The planters and their allies were adamantly against the granting of suffrage to the former slaves. What happened during the course of the war when these Confederate armies would collapse and flee, Lincoln would appoint military governors of these various states. It's what happened in Tennessee. They appointed Andrew Johnson, who later became president. He was a newspaper publisher out of Knoxville, and he was appointed military governor in late 1862, and this was done in other states as well. And the slave owners and their supporters were disenfranchised to a large degree in those states during those early years. So the people who had any political control there were people outside of the ruling elites in the South. Now, this controversy surrounding the interpretation of the 13th Amendment will continue with the adoption of both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. There have been recent statements from politicians within the so-called Tea Party movement that have questioned the constitutionality of not only the 14th Amendment, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964. People may have heard these statements that have been made recently. One guy said that he thought the 1964 Civil Rights Act went too far. Well, this is the same argument that Southern racists were making during the 1960s, that if white people owned a business, or if they had an institution that they claim they built, they have a right, and the government shouldn't force them to allow black people in. So if you have a restaurant, you're a white man in the South, you have a right as a private business owner to say that black folks shouldn't be able to come in your business, and that it was unconstitutional for the government to make you and force you to allow black folks into your businesses. These are the type of arguments that I heard when I was a child growing up in the South against civil rights. And these same arguments are resurfacing right now in the United States. You know, one man was talking at the Tea Party Summit, was talking about how the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional, that was passed the year after the Civil Rights Act in 1965. And even the 14th Amendment has been open to Supreme Court interpretation since 1873 with the Slaughterhouse case, which declared, even in 1873, that the 14th Amendment was not specifically applicable to the former slaves, and that a private corporation had greater rights than the people who the actual amendment was drafted to protect, ostensibly protect. And we just saw recently another Supreme Court decision where they said that multinational corporations have equal rights, actually they have superior rights to us, you know, to engage in political campaigns, and even more so determine who runs for office and who's elected to office in the United States. W.B. Du Bois, in Black Reconstruction, points to this important debate that took place within Congress in 1865. After the passage of the 13th Amendment, a civil rights bill was introduced that was met with skepticism and opposition. This was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, was the first Civil Rights Act ever introduced to Congress after the conclusion of the Civil War and the end of slavery. Du Bois notes again that, quote, "The Civil Rights Bill was taken up on December 13th of 1865, but Sherman of Ohio reminded the Senate that there was scarcely a state in the Union that did not make distinctions on account of color, and wished therefore to postpone action until the 13th Amendment has been adopted." It was certified by the Secretary of State at the end of that same month, December 1865. Salisbury of Maryland called it, quote, "an insane effort to elevate the African to the dignity of the white race," unquote, and claimed that the 13th Amendment would carry no such power as Sherman assumed, unquote.